Welcome guys back to the channel. We are in, I guess you would call this a sleeper, because I didn't know anything about this car until Alex mentioned that he had it. Alex here, you guys might remember, he had the Veloster N, still has the Veloster N that we reviewed a few years back. But this is his 2018 Hyundai Elantra. Sport. Yes. So tell me about this car. I know nothing about it, just let me know what you know about it.
If you know the Veloster N, you can kind of think this car. Because this was Alex Bierman's first brainchild, if you want to say.
And that's the guy who came from BMW M division.
Yes. The biggest difference between this and every other Elantra that's in this model, not only the engine, it's a 1.6 liter turbocharged engine, makes around 200 horsepower. But the biggest difference is it now has a fully independent rear suspension. And actually, this entire suspension geometry was carried over from this car to the current generation Veloster, which the Veloster N technically also sits on. So you could actually take current gen Veloster suspension and put it on this car, if you so please. The brakes on this car are 1 inch bigger than the base Elantras, and you get 18-inch wheels, we get a full leather interior, you got heated seats, which is really interesting.
I was gonna say, it's actually a pretty comfortable interior.
Yeah. It's a lot of people, which is really, it's really interesting that people kind of look at this car and like, oh wow, it's got full leather interior. It's so nice. It's better. It's nicer than my car. It's like, yeah, it's a Elantra.
From outside, it's not much of a looker. It just looks like your standard, few-year-old Hyundai. But the crazy thing is, this is not stock. So you're pushing close to 300 wheel horsepower. So how did you get there?
Pretty simply, to be honest. There is a company in Korea that tunes a lot of just KDM cars, and they're kind of like the biggest market over there, or the biggest company they're kind of doing it, called Lap 3. I think they have a US subsidiary also called Lap 3 USA.
Okay.
This is their kit. It has a XT26 X-Cargo turbocharger. Okay. Which X-Cargo is actually a subsidiary of Garrett. So it's essentially a Garrett turbo. They have a custom manifold that looks like an equal length header manifold, I can't really tell, with a downpipe, and that's an entire package with an extra oil feed, and you kind of just drop the subframe, take out the old manifold with the turbo, and just put this in, put it all together, drop in their tune with some spark plugs, at minimum 270 wheel horsepower from that.
And it's reliable.
Yeah, I've had this car for 3 years, sitting
on
like
pump
that.
gas, 91.
91, well, you could have an option for a 91 tune, but currently I'm sitting on a 93 octane tune or an E30 tune. So essentially when I go to the pump, I put in 80% 91 octane, and then the remaining 20% I just dump in E85. Got it. Almost 10 track days, I think.
Oh, wow.
With this setup. So
how much does this car weigh?
Just about $3,000 without the spare tire. So you're sitting pretty close to the Veloster N.
Front wheel drive.
Open diff. Yeah.
7-speed dual clutch transmission, which is really cool. I've never tried a Hyundai with a dual clutch. Well, let's take this thing for a drive and see how it does. We have the traction and stability control fully turned off. Let's see how almost 300 wheel horsepower in a front wheel drive open diff Hyundai feels. Oh, it automatically shifted there for me.
Yes, it will auto upshift once you hit red line.
Okay. Very grabby brakes.
Yeah, so these are just the R12 compounds.
G-Lock, right?
Yep, and that's it.
Gotta say, it makes some really cool turbo whoosh sounds. And you've got aftermarket suspension too, right?
Yeah, they're not great, but they kind of do okay.
Because there's such a small aftermarket for this car, right? You don't have many options.
Surprisingly, a decent aftermarket. A lot more than you would expect from a car like this. If you want to do something with this car, usually there's something that you could take it aftermarket with to do it with. But the suspension is just basically DGR coilovers. Okay. Taiwanese made? Yeah, some Taiwanese company. Pretty cheap. I think the spring rates are like 9.6 or something like that. Okay, pretty soft. It's not doing too bad out here. There's a little bit of bounce from that rear axle, but the front feels fairly responsive. Not a ton of steering feel, but the nice thing is there's not much torque steer. And I think you were mentioning the power band of this engine with the aftermarket turbo kit. It's all at the top end. There's really no boost really below around $4,000. Essentially. So the turbo doesn't fully spool until around $4,000.
Okay.
In comparison, the OEM turbo is a TD03, and that will max out its spool at about 2,000.
Ah, okay.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, it's super...
super small, super torquey.
Yeah, that's how most modern turbo 4-cylinders feel.
Basically. And now our torque band kind of hits max torque at around 4.5.
Okay.
And
that's really high up.
It tapers off completely flat after that, according to the dyno charts. And then the horsepower band is basically a straight line.
Got it.
So in a straight line, it'll feel like a naturally aspirated car. And you won't feel this like weird torque dip and going up and down and up and down. And since it's a DCT, if you hold down the throttle while shifting, it'll hold your boost.
Okay, so yeah, the uninterrupted power band.
Exactly.
The DCT is good, man. It's not great, but I would put this on par with like a Mark 7 Volkswagen GTI, like that
Really?
TSG. It's not that far off. Yeah, so there is a delay from when you pull the paddle and then when it shifts, but the shift action itself is pretty crisp.
Yes.
I think that's the defining trait of like older DCTs or like slower DCTs versus newer.
Yep.
It's not necessarily the actual action of shifting that feels different. It's that delay from when you ask it to shift to when it actually starts shifting.
Yeah. There have been issues with it. I haven't hit any of those issues, which is really surprising. But for the most part, it's fairly clunky. If you have to like stop and go, it's also really clunky. You can kind of think of like trying to drive a GTR. It's like older generation GTR with the early generation dual clutch. Those are known to be very clunky.
Very clunky, yeah.
So it's kind of similar to that in how it feels, which is really strange comparing a GTR to this car.
Yeah.
But
in that one aspect, they're kind of similar, yes. The downshifts are better than the upshifts, which is the case in most dual clutches that I've tried.
Yeah.
Pedal, and it just gives it to you right away. Well, I'll tell you what, the 300 wheel horsepower feels good.
What if
On
I
the
told
straights,
you
it feels good.
we're not at 300 horsepower?
It feels a little bit less than that, honestly. Like more like 250-ish, maybe?
Around 270. We have two people. With two people, it actually feels a lot slower.
Okay.
But luckily, we have something called a Ready Boost controller
Oh.
that sits in the middle of your steering column. So if you hold the top button, the blue button, for about 4 seconds, we'll hear a click. There you go.
Okay.
It should say high on the very top left corner. And now we're in higher boost. So before we were getting around 17 PSI.
Yeah.
And if I dial that in correctly, it should be at around 21, 22.
Well, let's test that. Oh yeah. That's a little more. It's definitely a little more. Decent mid-corner grip from these Champiro tires.
Yes. Oh yeah, the other interesting thing is this is currently a reversed staggered setup.
Oh really? So fronts are wider?
Yeah, so the front is sitting on a 17 by 9 inch wheel with a 245 tire.
Got it.
And the rear is sitting at a 17 by 8 wheel on a 235. I kind of want to downgrade to a 225. I think it'll feel a little bit better.
All things considered, this thing handles pretty damn well for a Hyundai Elantra, or like at least what my preconceived notion of a Hyundai Elantra was going to be.
Yeah. It's no rear-wheel drive car where you can kind of play around with throttle, understeer, oversteer.
Yeah, it gives you options. It's not just an understeering pig. The comfort level, the sleeper quality of the car is like super cool to me. You would never think, looking at a car like this, unless you specifically knew what an Elantra Sport was, you would never think that this thing would actually be like fun to drive. It looks like just like a rental car.
Yep, essentially.
All right, let's try this second gear pull here.
Go for it.
Huh. Got a hint of torque steer, but it was really minimal. This thing puts the power down well, considering it has an open diff.
The wider tires really help. Back when it had the OEM tires with 225s, it actually just didn't do anything because it roasted them.
Oh.
So you'd be doing like a standing burnout just because the torque would kick in and you just spin the tires.
Yeah. I can see that. These tires hook up well. I'm surprised. I've never driven a car with Champiros before, but not bad. Not bad.
Yeah. But if you want tires that last an entire track day and more, pretty well.
Noted. Champiro tires. Might have to look into those. So that was very interesting. Thanks for letting me drive your Elantra Sport.
No problem.
It's so weird because like it's such a unique car. It's a unique proposition. I'm trying to compare it to other cars I've driven that are maybe similar to it. It feels like a warm hot hatch, sort of.
If so, what inspired me for this car was I sat in my friend's Golf TSI, which is basically a 1.8 liter turbo Golf.
Without the limited slip diff.
Without that, yeah. So it's like a downgraded GTI with less displacement, whatever. And we actually pushed around 280 wheel to that. And it felt really nice.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, I kind of want to do it, but I don't really want a Golf because everyone has a Golf.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I kind of want to look at the Civic Si. This is when the 10th gen came out with the turbo. I was like, I don't really want a Civic Si. And then I like stumbled across this and it's like, oh, no one's done this before. Yeah. Let me try doing it with this car.
Kind of one of the 10 people in the world who's like, oh, this might be a fun car to push 300 wheel horsepower in.
It wasn't originally like that, but I was a college student. I needed a car. I kind of wanted something kind of fun. And at its base, this was still a pretty fun car. Just because it was the first turbo car you would probably get into. It's the same thing with an SI. It has around the same horsepower, around the same weight. You just subtract the diff and the manual trans, which you can get a 6-speed in this car.
Oh, you can? And
it holds up pretty well. You could hold up to around 300, 320 wheel torque before the OEM clutch slips.
Okay.
So it's actually built
that's
pretty
like
well.
Close to double OEM.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Honestly, like, of course, I'm a manual diehard. I always prefer 6-speed, but this is not a bad transmission. Again, I would put it similar to like a Mark 7 or Mark 6 generation Golf GTI's DSG. Like, it's roughly around the same level of responsiveness. It might be a little jerkier in traffic, like you were saying, but out in the canyons, not bad. I wish it would bounce off the rev limiter instead of shifting up.
I wish too.
Yeah. All things considered, though, it's a fun car. It's a very cool sleeper. Yeah, I like the fact that you modded it. It's a one-of-a-kind kind of experience. So these are the cars I love to drive. The ones that you see it from outside and you're like, huh, I wonder what that is. Or like maybe you just don't even wonder because it's just like such a generic-looking car.
Every time I roll up on my friends, they're like, we didn't even know you came in.
Yeah. Exactly. So let me know what you guys think of the Hyundai Elantra Sport. The fact that Albert Bierman actually was in charge of this car is knowing that fact and then driving the car, everything starts to make sense. But without that very important tidbit, it's you go into it having no expectations and then you come away pleasantly surprised. So thanks guys for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so, and I'll see you next time.
Cool.